Today, we'll be delving into the extremely popular and yet at the same time niche corner of the classical world, that of video games. While I may not be the best Virgil to guide you through this digital realm, we have to assist us on this endeavor Professors Draycott and Cook to show how women are represented in classically themed video games. They'll explain what this means and why we should care. Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. You can now find us, along with our free newsletter, at classicalwisdom.substack.com. Today's Classical Wisdom Speaks podcast is with Jane Draycott, lecturer at the University of Glasgow, Scotland, and Kate Cook, associate lecturer in classics at the University of St. Andrews, also in Scotland. They are the editors of the recently released book published by Bloomsbury called Women in Classical Video Games, of which we will speak about today. But before we get into Assassin's Creed, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society subscribers. If you would like to become a member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com and subscribe. You can also help us out by subscribing to our podcast channel. Just hit that red button, subscribe to get your monthly dose of the classics. Now, how does studying the storyline of female characters in video games teach us about the ancient world or our modern society? So today we're going to be talking about a very interesting and niche subject, which is video games and the ancient world. And before we get started, I feel like I need to acknowledge my lack of knowledge in this department. I have two older brothers who were complete computer game addicts, and I built my identity in strong adversity to them. And so the last time I held a console, I think Sonic was still iconic. So I will apologize in advance to our video game followers for any daft questions I have that prove my dearth of knowledge in this department. And so we're going to start off maybe a little bit more basic. So for those who are very knowledgeable in this subject, you could probably skip a little bit to the head to the nuts and bolts. And for those who are like me and need a little hand holding into this subject, I'm going to begin with why are video games even set in the ancient world, and what are some of the major examples?
Partly, I think there are sort of two things that make the ancient world seem very popular as video game settings. And one of them is the same, it's true of sort of all cultural responses, in that there's a nice variety of kind of popular but not necessarily immediate topics. So quite a lot of people know some kind of Roman history or some Greek history or some Greek myth and so on, and you know, they like them. But these are not events that happened kind of 10 years ago, so most people are not living with them. So there's sufficient distance and familiarity to make it a really kind of popular creative area in general. And I also think that variety, so the combination of myth and history, makes it really popular for a wide variety of genres as well. So you can have the games that kind of go for the more historical settings, or you can have games that like to take a more fantastical, mythological approach. There's sort of flexibility there for different types of games to respond to.
I suppose it's also got a fairly, at least in Europe anyway, it's part of the collective past. The Romans got to most places in Europe at one time or another, and even different continents. In fact, you know, they got to North Africa, they got to the Middle East, and newer countries, cultures like North America, South America, Australasia. There is a sort of a sense of cultural inheritance from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, both deliberate and accidental. So these are things that, as Kate said, people are familiar with, but they also relate to it to a certain degree. You can go not too far away from where you live and you can see some Roman ruins. you can see neoclassical architecture, and that gives you a sort of sense of familiarity with it as well. Whereas that's something that you don't necessarily have with other cultures, other histories.
Is the purpose of it sometimes to just be educational?
I wouldn't say so. Not until very, very recently with the Assassin's Creed discovery modes. I think prior to that, if you were getting your, or if you thought you were getting your historical education from video games, I think you'd have to do a lot of double checking.
Yeah.
I suppose with things like strategy games, military strategy games, there are certain elements of those that are a bit more factual, but they're accompanied with a lot more interpretation, flexibility, adaptation, shall we say.
I think, yeah, the sole purpose as being education, I would agree, is something which we certainly kind of don't see in the quite long history of the ancient world in video games. But I think there's always been a tendency to present some information as part of the game, you know, whether that'll be codex entries or things like the Civilization series, where they like to include the little encyclopedia, which says it's giving you historical information as you kind of build and develop things and as you research different technologies. And that's been a kind of feature of quite a lot of these games for quite a long time. So they'll have, almost as a kind of add-on, extra information that you can look at that will tell you things about the ancient world, which is certainly aiming at being factual, you know, nearly all of the time. But it's very much an extra. It's certainly not the main purpose of the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think what possibly is more apparent is that games get people interested. They get children interested, teenagers, even adults interested to find out more about that particular period of history, that particular civilization, and they spark the imagination, and then people go off and educate themselves, having had that Kindle for them by the game.
And so what are some of the examples of video games right now, or historically, that have featured the ancient world, just to give us a recap for those of us who are a little less knowledgeable on that?
Sure. Well, right now, Assassin's Creed, which is a kind of very major game series with sort of tens of millions of players, has featured two games set in the ancient world, Odyssey and Origins, which were set in Greece in the Peloponnesian War and in the kind of early Roman Egypt / late Hellenistic, depending on how you want to define that time period. And there's, I mentioned Civilization before, which has had kind of ancient leaders as part of its lineup, a part of its roster for as long as it's been going. There've been quite a lot of city builders historically set in the ancient world, things like the Caesar series or the Pharaoh series, originally made by Sierra, but some of these were kind of remade. There's the Total War series that Jane mentioned, which has had entries from kind of ancient Rome and Troy. There's quite a lot of options. There's Hades, there's God of War. Jane, you can probably contribute to this list. These are kind of the major ones, but there's plenty more.
Yes, I think more recently, I think for a long time it was military focused stuff, strategy games, civilization builders, like Kate said. But perhaps more recently, there's been a bit more mythology-based games, the mythology being used as a basis for other, types of gameplay. So things like Hades, for example, or Theon. We do see stories that are a little bit more presented as a sort of semi-historical, so things like Rise, Son of Rome. It's not historical at all, but it sort of you play a centurion and you have a story and a quest that you go on. So yeah, there are loads of different genres that the ancient world setting is applied to. You find games that use aspects that they're not set in the ancient world, so things like the Fallout series, for example, or Horizon series, or the Elder Scrolls, and they use different aspects of classical culture and characters and aspects of mythology and history to sort of do their world building, but they're not specifically about antiquity.
And so for you guys, you've written or compiled a book about video games, specifically women in video games. What I'm really interested in is specifically the women, obviously, in these video games. How are they represented? And is it accurate or authentic as compared to, say, the men in the video games?
Well, I think it depends. Whether you find women in the games at all depends on the genre, because in the more military focused games, you don't generally, or if women are in them, there is sort of very minor damsel in distress type characters rather than playable characters with any sort of personality or agency. So whether that started to change, there are more female characters. You can play through Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for example, as a female character called Cassandra. But as to whether any of the male or female characters are accurate it's stretching it a little bit. The women, for the most part, certainly aren't. A lot of the men aren't either, though, but perhaps in slightly different ways. And as far as authentic is concerned, it does very much depend on what you consider to be authentic. So for a lot of players of these games, they don't believe that having women in the games at all is historically authentic. They think that women had no place in whatever aspect of ancient civilization the game is using. And so that, but then if you're more educated, factually informed, you'd have a different opinion about that.
Yeah, it'd be cool to have like a Boudica character in a war scene, or Artissima, or one of those. It's not like women didn't exist in the ancient world, so maybe they were less present in wars, but they were still examples.
Yeah. And it's worth saying, even in some of these strategy type games, there are increasing attempts to include women, including, as leaders of societies in games like the Civilization series. And in fact, Civilization has always tried to do that, but they've been, in the most recent iterations, very explicit about this being an intention that they want to have better representation across their roster of leaders. And they're including more women as part of that. And these are often figures who are historical to a certain degree. Some of the people they pick out are sort of mythologized leaders, so they're not necessarily what you might call strictly historical. That's true of men and women, but there's certainly always an attempt in those instances to try and make a sort of historically accurate figure, whatever we might mean by that. And I would say there's probably more attempts to make kind of background characters who represent some sort of ideas of historically accurate women, like, for example, the women we see weaving in the streets in Assassin's Creed Odyssey were sort of quite noticeable, because it was an attempt to attach these sort of background characters to something which is relatively historically accurate, that women do weaving. I don't know if they necessarily always set up their weaving kind of in public to do it all the time, but it gives a kind of space, it gives a female space to the background, which I think we're seeing more of, and which certainly attempts to be accurate, although, as Jane says, then when you get kind of perceptions of what is and isn't accurate or authentic, things get a lot more complicated in that regard.
I think somewhere that women have always featured is when gods are being depicted, because of course in the ancient Greek pantheon there were both male and female deities, and so in games like God of War that have had a very sort of strong mythological component to them, there has been the opportunity to have goddesses playing a role as well as gods. But again, is there a historically accurate way to depict a deity of an ancient religion that would you see Jesus in a video game? Would you see other deities and start to sort of fact check their portrayals. So yes, you see goddesses appearing in games, but they are generally not depicted in a way that we might consider to be accurate or authentic. They are more I think it's more about taking the particular attributes that deity is known for, and then fashioning those in a way that might appeal to the contemporary player. So for example, if you're going to depict the goddess Aphrodite, everybody knows that Aphrodite is the goddess of love and sex, but ancient Greek love and sex is not the same as contemporary 21st century love and sex, but that's what you're going to get in her portrayal in a game.
Now, you just mentioned contemporary audience, Jane, and it's interesting. I imagine, but I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the general audience has increased in demographics with regards to including more women, that more women play video games now than did 10 years ago. And so it kind of makes sense to what you were saying, Kate, that they've been introducing a lot more female characters, because that would reflect their growing demographic of female players as well. But when they added a lot more women characters, was there any pushback from the fans and any response from the audience?
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Some of which was so significant that it even made mainstream media. Now, it is worth saying that there's some discussion about how much mainstream media was trying to kind of emphasize this as a big issue, because there has been pushback, whether it necessarily was sufficient to garner the amount of interest it did, or whether the interest was kind of regenerating the pushback is a question. But there was the Total War female generals scandal, as many kind of news outlets reported it a little while ago, had effectively female generals introduced into the Total War, well, fans thought introduced into the Total War series. In fact, they'd been there for some time. It's just that an update made them come up a little more frequently. They readjusted how often they were becoming part of the game. And there were huge complaints about this as a kind of historically accurate or not perception. And we found when we were looking, when we were researching for this book, we looked at quite a lot of, players' comments and forum comments on a range of different games. And there is nearly always somewhere, someone's complaining about the inclusion of women as leaders, as Amazons, even as kind of mythological figures, as being politically correct or done for marketing. Some players accuse it quite often as being a sort of marketing move to include more women, rather than
or women
representing...
working in the games companies with an agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, the takeover of the feminists is kind of, ruining games for some people by having these very small number of female characters introduced. And it's worth saying that this is something which you see not just in kind of historical games or even ancient world video games, but across the games industry. There's been quite a lot of, relatively famous pushback about the role of women or the representation of women in these games. That has also been the case for these ancient world video games.
I think it's interesting that statistically more women play games than men across the whole spectrum of all the different types of games. But then if you drill down into that, it varies according to type of game, whether you're playing console games or mobile games, the different genres of games as well. So when there is this claim that women and girls don't play games, generally what's being referred to are the sort of AAA shooter type games with the stereotype of the adolescent boy in the basement, basically. And actually more and more girls and women are playing games, but potentially, yes, they're not playing the sort of Second World War based shooters, but what they're playing are other types of games, and potentially on mobiles and the Nintendo Switch, things like that. And because you find antiquity pretty much everywhere, I think it's fair to say that you find women playing games that are set in antiquity pretty much everywhere. Maybe they're playing them on their phone, maybe they're playing them on their Switch, maybe they're playing them on their PlayStation or their Xbox, but they are playing them. So when these claims are made that you're forcing women into games where they shouldn't be, and why are you even bothering, because only men play the games and men don't want to see the women anyway, which is what some commentators did actually say about the Total War games. Women don't play these games, why are you forcing women into these games? Actually, they do. Possibly not as many as play other types of games, but they certainly are there, and would appreciate some representation.
Now, Kate, you mentioned before the discovery modes, and this is something, again, for us newbies to this kind of world, I didn't know anything about. Could you maybe explain what they are and how you would rate them, how they play a role in all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the discovery tours come normally a little while after the main game is released. They've done them for the last 3 games in the Assassin's Creed series, and they are effectively the game world without the gameplay. So you can walk around in the world. There are still NPCs, that's non-player characters, so people who just kind of hang around you, getting on with their lives. And you can look at things, and then they have particular tours established in them, which supposedly give insight into a small area of the society or the literature or whatever it might be. So, for example, there's one on Greek theatre in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which allows you to sort of look at the 3D theatre that they built, and then tells you some information about the kind of plays that happened and the festivals around the theatres and so on. So they're designed for education. And while you're going on this tour, you're not going to get attacked, and you can't attack anyone else. And so, the sort of gameplay element is stripped out, so it focuses entirely on education and information and exploration as well, because it still creates this 3D space for you, and not on assassination, which obviously is the focus of the rest of the game.
But also there are certain things that are not included, so things like nudity, which you would find in the main game. They censor the discovery tours.
Yes. Yeah, and they're aimed at, they have various kind of pricing packages that aimed at educational institutions. So they claimed to want, when they were releasing these, them to be used in the classroom as a kind of educational resource, which obviously the main game is not intended to be. In terms of rating them, I've talked about this quite a lot at length elsewhere. I do think they do some really good things. In particular, the 2 Ancient World ones are quite good at attaching information to specific material or sources. So, for example, they'll give you a quote from an ancient author, or they'll show you quite a lot of the best bits of the tours, show you an ancient artifact. So they'll have a picture of a particular pot or item that's in the British Museum or in an American collection, and they'll kind of tell you where it is, and give you a quite detailed view of these particular artifacts, which is really good for sort of connecting the information in the game and the information that they're telling you to specific evidence. I do think there's some problems with them. I think some things kind of have quite a lot of gaps. I was very unimpressed, staying on today's theme, with Assassin's Creed Odyssey's tour on women's lives, both in terms of the sources they were using and in terms of the complete lack of detail that was given to this tour in comparison to some of the others. And there are, some minor, but there are some factual inaccuracies in places, and some places where I feel like it kind of needed more space to give a more nuanced view than they really can do in this sort of format. But having said that, what they are really good for is taking, people who are interested in the game, if they want to go and learn more and they want to go and start thinking about what sort of evidence is this impression of ancient Greece built on, they do that really well. So I think they have, some real strengths and maybe some weaknesses as well.
Jane, would you add to your view on the discovery modes?
Yes, I would agree with what Kate said. I think for certain things, so because the historical accuracy and the research and the involvement of historians and archaeologists is a big part of the promotion of these games and these tours, it's almost fetishized, really. It's used to sort of justify and sort of provide cover for other things. But certainly the care that has been taken to build the world means that if you are interested in topography, for example, and you want to wander around Delphi or Athens or Alexandria, and what you're interested in doing is a very sort of, where are these buildings in relation to each other? What am I going to see if I'm taking this route, etc.? That's fantastic. If you are interested in more specific things, I'll give the example of the Discovery Tour in Assassin's Creed Origins, which is devoted to Cleopatra. That is full of historical inaccuracies. And
yeah, I can imagine.
really, that's inexcusable. If the amount of research that has claimed to have been done has been done in relation to Cleopatra, the kind of errors that are in that tour shouldn't really be there, because it's not hard to find information about Cleopatra, historical information about Cleopatra. The sources are fairly mainstream. Yes, you could argue that there is a lot of anti-Egyptian, anti-Cleopatra propaganda, but as far as things like, the facts of her life, her date of birth, her date of death, that kind of thing, that's readily available information. And so I haven't by any means done a lot of the Discovery tours. I have done a few, and so I'm sort of like, if this is the general standard as applied to Cleopatra, a subject that should be very easy to research the basic facts of, I'm not optimistic about the factual accuracy of other topics, either very well attested historical figures or historical events, or the more nebulous stuff that is actually more open to scholarly interpretation, and presenting these complex debates as very much, well, this happened and this happened and this happened, gives a very skewed idea of history to people who are coming to this for the first time. If they think, oh right, yes, this is what happened and this is the way it happened, whereas of course academics argue about everything, even the most supposedly well-known, widely known stuff is not actually so secure when we get talking about it.
And do you guys know much about the process when they're putting these video games together? Do they have professors weigh in? Do they consult with people, or is it, I mean, do we know that there's authorities involved?
It depends very much on the game. My partner is a computer game programmer. He works for a computer game studio, and the extent to which companies consult experts depends very much on the company, its culture, what the creative team are trying to do. In the case of Ubisoft and the Assassin's Creed franchise, they make a big point about how much they have consulted with archaeologists, Egyptologists, classicists, historians, etc., about their games. They name the historical advisors. The historical advisors give interviews and things. So in that respect, they are clearly engaging with academics. Other games, like for example Rise, Son of Rome, that game developer was much more, well, we just wanted to take a bit of this and a bit of that, and we weren't really interested in historical accuracy. And so under those circumstances, yeah, it's not something that they're really bothered about. But more and more companies are advertising for historical advisors about specific things in relation to their games. So clearly some game developers are very keen to get certain things right. And as far as things like Roman military equipment is concerned, you know, people, firstly, they both know and they care if you get it wrong. And secondly, there are plenty of people and resources to refer to if you want to get the exact right type of sword or type of helmet for this particular period. So yes, it's easier to get that sort of thing historically accurate than it necessarily is to get something like women's lives historically accurate, because of course we have archaeological evidence for women's lives, but it perhaps has not been quite so academically covered as Roman military equipment.
Even Cleopatra.
Even Cleopatra.
Breaks my heart. Love Cleopatra. With that all in mind then, and considering the fields in which the games sort of take place with regards to war and violence and all that stuff, does it make it a good medium for teaching?
Yeah, as we've just been saying, the ancient world was a very unpleasant, unsavory place in many respects, and just as one would pick and choose quite carefully the sorts of texts that you're teaching students to read Greek or Latin in, you would hope that people would be careful about what they choose there, and then would use these texts with a whole lot of commentary, appropriate commentary. There's no reason why you can't do the same thing with games. You wouldn't necessarily, if you were teaching primary school children, go into huge amounts of detail about sex and violence, but there's no reason why you can't do that with university students.
Yeah, and I mean, so I was just teaching some of these games about a week and a half ago, so of course I think we can and should teach with them, but I think it depends what you're trying to teach, right? If I want my students to gain a clear understanding of the chronological history of the Roman Republic, I'm not going to send them off to play Total Rome 2 and just sort of hope they get that, because that's not what games are for. They're not trying to give a sort of chronology or factual information, but to think about things like what the society was like, and also particularly what kind of narratives about the ancient world are we as a society now interested in? Why are we interested in those narratives? You know, what sort of characters keep coming up? A lot of the time as well, it's worth remembering our students, particularly, you know, secondary school upwards, are playing these games anyway. By not bringing them into the classroom, that's not going to make them go away. And, you know, nor should we try to make them go away. I think often students are playing things like these games and then thinking, this is great, I want to know more about the ancient world. And we can take them in, and then we can say, great, and let's also think about the ways your ideas of the ancient world have been shaped by this game you're playing in your own time. So I think there's a lot of, as I say, not necessarily kind of factual teaching to be done, but there's an awful lot of really valuable things we can do by engaging with these games in our teaching and research.
I think a few years ago, prospective students at all levels, they were getting their information about antiquity from TV and from film, and possibly some fiction. But I think it's more common now that they're getting their information from games and from graphic novels, I think currently. And that's something that we as teachers need to be aware of. You know, where are our students first encountering antiquity, and how? I mean, I've got to the point, I've been teaching long enough now that a lot of my references for popular culture when it comes to antiquity, they're out of date. If I say to students, have you seen HBO Rome? Have you seen 300? They will say no, because
no, those ones are out of date. No, now I feel really old.
HBO Rome, it came out in 2005. You know,
I thought you were going to say
season.
BBC's I, Claudius.
Well, exactly. I, Claudius came out in what, the 70s? I mean, I haven't seen I, Claudius, or you know, so. But things that we sort of watched, Gladiator came out what, over 20 years ago, and we've got to bear in mind the sheer amount of popular culture that people are being bombarded with nowadays, and with streaming services and everything. On the one hand, potentially you can see something that on streaming that hasn't been available for a long time. On the other, if something's not on streaming, do people even watch DVDs anymore? I think we have to bear in mind that, yeah, the ancient world and the way that it's packaged for this sort of the contemporary audience, it is constantly changing. And so, yeah, those films and TV shows that were once this sort of crucial touchstone because there just wasn't a whole lot of stuff available. There's now loads of stuff available, but in different areas. I mean, the most recent Roman TV shows, there was Domina that was on Sky. So if you don't have Sky, you can't see that. There was a German show, Barbarians, I think it's called, that was about the sort of Varian disaster. That's on Netflix. If you don't have Netflix, you can't see that. It's not Netflix's content isn't available in any other forum. So people are a lot of media is now siloed off. Whereas games, you can play games. You can, whatever console you've got, most games are available for it. You can watch playthroughs on YouTube if you don't have the game. And so they're accessible in a way that perhaps TV and film isn't really anymore.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. And Netflix too is country specific. So sometimes what you can see in the UK, you can't see here in Argentina or in the US or elsewhere. And also, can I just say with regards to the graphic novel, I can definitely recommend Donald Robertson's newest graphic novel about the life and times of Marcus Aurelius. I just did a review of that one and it was really good. So I'm trying to appreciate these different mediums because, that's where people are. And, even for us, Classical Wisdom, I mean, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, all those things, because that's where everybody is. So if you want to get the next generation or even the current generation excited about the classics, you've got to find them where they are. So I think that's very valuable with regards to video games. And as you say, they're going to be playing them anyway. So why not make a conversation about it and say what's right and what's wrong? Now, Jane and Kate, you guys have already been so generous with your time. So I will want to finish up with one last question for each of you, which is, who is your favorite female character in any of these ancient video games?
Well, mine, I don't have a favorite character in an ancient video game, but I do have a favorite character in a game that uses a lot of classical reception. So does that count?
Sure, I think we'll allow that.
So mine would be Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West. That is it's a game set in a very far distant post-apocalyptic future where humanity and most of the sort of life on Earth was wiped out and gradually had to restart. But there are remnants of the ancient civilization, which is like our sort of civilization, and you find in the world, and a lot of those are classical knowledge, classical related. So you go on like little archaeological excavations in these ancient settlements, which are the ruins of our skyscrapers and things like that, and you uncover references to antiquity, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and so that's my favorite.
I'm going to go with I think I am going to go with someone I wrote the chapter in my chapter in our book on, just because it was kind of a strikingly interesting and different perception on some of these characters, and that is she is another courtesan. But she's called Arin, although you could change her name, and she's from the mobile game Choices, in the story A Courtesan of Rome, and she is previously enslaved Gallic daughter of the kind of chieftain of her clan, and she eventually has this kind of long revenge narrative that she plays out at the end of the Republic, which will result in you killing Caesar, which is not a spoiler since that happens in history. But she raises a lot of questions about the kind of situation of people like her, about being a foreign woman in Rome, and to what level she's had to adapt herself to the situation in order to achieve her goals, and provided a really, I think, interesting and kind of fun way of looking at a lot of these questions. And she was a very well-drawn character with a lot of exciting relationships to other characters and to her family, and you can make her say some very rude things for no reason at all, just to, you know, insult the rich Romans around her. It doesn't always go fantastically if you do that. She won't necessarily get her revenge if you keep upsetting everyone around her, but she had some, you know, good fun dialogue, and I appreciated that. So I'm sticking with Aaron. She's going to be my favorite.
When it comes to playable female characters, there are not that many to choose from. There are sort of another character who's pretty good is Aya in Assassin's Creed Origins, and she is the wife, the estranged wife of the person that you play as, Bayek, and she's an assassin. She ultimately, outside of the game, she assassinates Caesar herself also. This is clearly a thing going on, but she's also involved in the supposed assassination of Cleopatra, and so yeah, but you don't play as her for most of the game. But she's there, and she has enough space within the game to actually have a personality and a story arc, whereas obviously a lot of female characters in games do not have that luxury.
Sounds like she was really busy with all those assassinations.
Absolutely, it's a full-time job. You know, that is the underlying story of the Assassin's Creed games, that, you know, if you're an assassin, it's a way of life. It's a creed. You can't get away from it.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking your time to speak with me today, and I might even try out a video game myself sometime soon. I'll have to let you know how I go. And thank you again.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks. Please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com to learn more about our work and to sign up for our free newsletter. To find Kate and Jane's book, Women in Classical Video Games, please go to bloomsbury.com. The exact link is below.